What was it really like to be a woman in the heart of the Roman Empire? Not a goddess in a marble statue, not a queen in a golden palace, but a real woman living behind stone walls, under strict rules, bound by silence. History remembers the Roman world through its emperors, its armies, and its architecture. But beneath the noise of conquest and politics, there were voices that were never recorded. Women who lived under laws they could not change, trapped in marriages they did not choose, expected to be obedient, invisible, and pure until death. This is not a story of luxury and togas. This is a story of duty, of danger, and of daily survival. In this video, we'll quietly uncover the hidden world of women in ancient Rome. You'll learn how girls were married as children, how laws treated them as property, how childbirth could mean death, and how even the most powerful women lived under constant threat of shame, punishment, or exile. From the homes of enslaved women to the chambers of noble brides, from sacred rituals to secret resistance, we will explore every layer of life, love, and loss in a world that expected women to endure without complaint. And yet, some did more than survive. They left behind traces, whispers, in stone, in letters, in forgotten corners of Roman life. Stay with us until the end, as we bring those whispers back to life. Welcome to Restless Historian, where forgotten lives are never truly lost. If you find peace in the quiet corners of history, please like this video and subscribe to join us on the next journey into the past. In ancient Rome, the moment of birth was not one of celebration. It was a test. For mothers, it was often life-threatening. For infants, it was uncertain. And for baby girls, it was sometimes fatal, not because of illness, but because of a decision. When a child was born, the midwife would clean and wrap the baby, then place it at the feet of the father, the paterfamilias. He alone decided whether the newborn would live. If he picked the child up, it was accepted into the household. If he turned away or stayed silent, the baby was removed. This was not symbolic, it was literal. Infanticide, especially of girls, was legal and common. The reason was simple: daughters cost money. Sons carried the family name and could inherit land. They could work, fight, and one day lead the household. But daughters needed dowries. They would one day marry and leave. From the Roman father's point of view, a daughter was an investment, with little return. Some historians estimate that nearly 1 in 3 baby girls in poorer Roman families may have been exposed, left outside to die. It was not always done cruelly. Sometimes the baby was given to a temple or left near a market in hopes that someone else might take her in. But more often, she was abandoned. No record, no burial, just silence. For those who survived, life did not belong to them. It belonged to the man who raised them. The paterfamilias was not just a father, he was a legal authority, a religious head, and an absolute master over everyone in the household. His wife, his sons, his slaves, and especially his daughters were all under his control. A Roman girl's name reflected this lack of individuality. Unlike boys, who had 3 names, a personal name, praenomen, a family name, nomen, and sometimes an honorific cognomen, girls were given one name, the feminine form of their fathers, noem, M. So, if a Roman man named Marcus Tullius had a daughter, she would be named Tullia. If he had a second daughter, she might be Tullia Secunda, or just Tullia the Younger. The name belonged to the family, not to the girl. She was not expected to be remembered outside of it. In wealthier homes, Daughters were raised with some education, music, spinning, reading, and basic arithmetic. But this was not to prepare them for independence. It was to make them better wives. They were taught silence, obedience, and modesty. They learned how to manage a household, how to please a husband, and how to raise sons. Their value was always tied to marriage. By the time a girl reached age 10 or 11, her future was already being arranged. Marriage negotiations often began at 12. That was the minimum legal age. Wealthy families, eager to form alliances, sometimes acted sooner. The father controlled every aspect of the marriage agreement: the husband, the dowry, the terms. A dowry was a critical part of this transaction. It was a financial offering from the bride's family to the groom. It could include land, gold, servants, or future promises. The dowry served two purposes. First, it made the daughter more desirable. Second, it ensured she would be treated well, or at least that she came with enough resources to matter. But it also added to the burden of raising girls. For families with limited wealth, every daughter represented a future cost. There were some exceptions. In rare cases, a daughter inherited property, usually when no male heirs existed. But even then, she would not control it. Her husband or male guardian would manage it in her name. A daughter remained under her father's potestas, or legal power, until he transferred that power to her husband. In other words, from birth to marriage. A Roman girl was someone's legal possession. She had no right to choose a spouse, no right to refuse marriage, and no claim to personal freedom. Her body, her name, her future all belonged to men. In rural areas and among lower-class families, girls had fewer restrictions, but also fewer protections. They were expected to help with labor, cooking, weaving, gathering food. In some homes, girls worked alongside enslaved women. They learned the difference between being free and being helpless was sometimes only a matter of law. For enslaved girls, life was worse. They had no father to protect them, no family name. They could be sold at any age. No one asked if they wished to marry. They were paired, bred, and discarded as needed. Their bodies were property in the most literal sense, even in elite households. Female children were expected to be invisible. Public life belonged to boys. Education, debate, and public recognition were male privileges. Girls stayed home. If they went out, they were veiled. If they spoke, it was softly. Many Roman writers ignored women entirely, but a few, like Plutarch and Livy, mentioned daughters only in relation to their fathers. A daughter's value was measured by her loyalty, her modesty, and her silence. One popular Roman saying, attributed to Cato the Elder, was, "The less a woman is heard of, the better." It applied to girls as well. In artwork and inscriptions, children were depicted playing or learning, but girls rarely appear alone. When they do, they are shown at the loom beside their mother or seated at their father's feet. Their lives were domestic, controlled, hidden, even in death. A girl's life was rarely her own. Roman tombs often included inscriptions for sons praising their virtues, their bravery, their promise. But for daughters, the inscriptions focused on purity, chastity, and obedience. They were remembered not for what they did, but for how quietly they had lived. In one epitaph from the 1st century, a grieving father wrote, "To my daughter, Claudia, who never disobeyed me, who stayed in the house, who spun wool, who bore no shame." It was meant as praise, but it reveals everything. In Rome, to be a daughter was not to be born free. It was to be born with rules already written, to be spoken for, given away, and remembered only if you were silent enough. In the Roman world, freedom was never just about being alive. It was about legal standing, about the ability to speak, to act, and to be heard. For Roman women, these rights were always out of reach. From the Republic through the Empire, women in Rome were legally classified as infames. This Latin word didn't simply mean without fame. It meant something deeper: without standing, without voice, without power in the eyes of the law. They were not criminals. They were not enemies. They were simply excluded. Roman law did not permit women to vote. They could not hold political office. They could not serve in the Senate or take part in the forum debates. Their opinions, no matter how educated, had no bearing on the decisions that shaped their society. They lived in the heart of one of history's most powerful civilizations. But legally, they were never considered full citizens. This absence extended to public life. In the courts, women could not serve as advocates or jurors. They could appear as witnesses, but their testimony was considered less reliable than a man's. Often, it required male confirmation to be accepted. Women could bring legal complaints, but only under the permission of a male guardian. In other words, a woman could not defend her rights without asking someone else to do it for her. That someone was almost always a father or a husband, and behind that arrangement stood the most powerful structure in a Roman woman's legal life: manus. Manus, literally, hand, was the Roman concept of male authority over women. It meant that a woman existed legally under the hand of another man. As a girl, she was under her father's manus. When she married, she passed into her husband's. If she was widowed or divorced, she did not gain independence. Instead, she returned to the control of a male guardian, her closest male relative, or an appointed legal tutor. This system was known as tutela. Tutela was not optional. Roman women, no matter their age or status, could not be entirely free under the law. Even wealthy and educated women, those who owned property or managed estates, needed male authorization. For certain contracts, business dealings, or legal disputes. In the early Republic, manus was absolute. A husband could control not only a woman's property, but her very movements. Over time, during the imperial era, certain upper-class women gained more financial freedom. The manus system weakened slightly for them. Some could manage their dowries, inherit land, or even own slaves. But the core principle remained. The law did not trust women to act alone. This guardianship was not symbolic. It was enforced. If a woman wanted to sell land, she needed her tutor's approval. If she wanted to free a slave, she needed written consent. If she wished to change her will, donate to a temple, or bring a claim in court, she needed a man too. Speak for her. Even the concept of auctoritas, the Latin word for legal authority, was reserved for men. Roman women could have dignitas, a sense of honor or pudication, modesty and virtue, but they could never possess a uctoritas. In private, they were expected to be quiet. In public, they were expected to be invisible. Roman literature often reflects this silence. The voices of women are rarely preserved. When they do appear, it is through the lens of male authors' husbands, historians, or moralists. Writers like Cicero and Livy praised the ideal Roman matron as one who stayed at home, remained obedient, and avoided scandal. Their admiration was for restraint, not achievement. Even in legal codes, women were defined not by what they could do, but by what they must not. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest set of laws, contain multiple references to women. They forbid women from mourning to loudly at funerals. They limit how much jewelry a woman may wear. They describe how her estate should pass through male relatives if she dies without sons. These laws were not interested in female rights. They were interested in female control. One of the few exceptions to this silence was the role of the Vestal Virgins. These women, chosen in childhood to serve the goddess Vesta, were granted unusual privileges. They could own property, make wills, and were free from the control of Manus. They walked Rome freely, guarded by the state, but their lives were also strictly regulated. Their vow of chastity was absolute. If broken, the punishment was live burial. Their freedom came at a price: total dedication and lifelong restriction. Most Roman women did not live in temples. They lived in houses where law and custom dictated every part of life. A father could arrange a marriage without his daughter's consent. A husband could divorce his wife without reason. A male guardian could block a financial transaction with a single word. Roman law did not consider women irrational or foolish. It simply considered them secondary. They were meant to obey, to preserve family honor, to produce heirs. Anything outside of that was seen as unnatural or dangerous. This belief extended to education. While some noble women were taught to read and write, it was considered unnecessary for most. Rhetoric, law, and politics, the pillars of Roman learning, were reserved for boys. A woman's learning was expected to serve the household, not the Republic. There were, of course, exceptions. Women like Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, were respected for their intellect. Empresses like Livia and Agrippina held real political influence behind the scenes. But these women worked through the men around them. They were careful, they were discreet, and they always presented their actions as service, not ambition. Public ambition was dangerous. A woman who spoke too freely, acted too boldly, or stepped beyond her expected role was quickly shamed, or worse. The law had few protections against slander, violence, or coercion. A woman's reputation could be ruined with a whisper. Her legal options were few. Even property laws favored male heirs. A daughter could inherit if no sons existed, but her rights were fragile. Upon marriage, her dowry became the husband's to manage. If she died, it returned to her father's family. In many cases, women could not pass property freely to their own children without legal battles. The legal system, designed by men for men, left little room for female agency. Yet within this structure, some women found ways to navigate the restrictions. They used influence, intelligence, and quiet negotiation. Some managed estates, arranged marriages for their children, or advised powerful sons. But their achievements were always behind the curtain. The Roman woman lived in the shadow of the law, present but not protected, visible but not heard. She was not meant to speak for herself in public, and under Roman law, she was never expected. To beat marriage in the past was rarely about love. It was a contract, a transaction, a strategy. For many families, especially the powerful and the wealthy, marriage was a tool to gain land, status, or political advantage. The bride and groom were often pawns, especially the bride. Daughters were bargaining chips. Fathers negotiated their futures as if trading cattle. A promising alliance with a wealthier family could change a family's status overnight. So the feelings of the young girl didn't matter. Her preferences, her dreams, none of it factored in. She was expected to obey, to submit. In many societies, Girls were married off as young as 12, some even younger. As soon as they were biologically capable of bearing children, they were considered ready, not emotionally, not intellectually, just physically. A girl's childhood could end in an instant. One day she might be playing with dolls or picking flowers. The next, she was draped in bridal garments, trembling, and sent away to a man she had never met. A man often decades older. This wasn't seen as cruel. It was expected. It was tradition. The groom, on the other hand, enjoyed freedom. He could be older, educated, and well-traveled. In many cultures, he had the power of life and death over his wife. This wasn't a metaphor. A husband could beat, imprison, or even kill his wife often without consequence. Laws favored men, customs favored men. Religion too was often interpreted in ways that gave men more authority in the household. If a wife was disobedient, there were accepted punishments. If she failed to produce sons, it was her fault. If she spoke too much, she was nagging. If she stayed quiet, she was cold. There was no winning, and divorce. That, too, was another trap. In theory, divorce existed in many ancient and medieval societies, but the reality was different for women. For men, it could be as easy as declaring the marriage over. For women, it was almost impossible. She needed proof of extreme cruelty, abandonment, or some form of disgrace. Even then, she could be blamed for the failure. A woman who left her husband, even under the worst conditions, was seen as damaged, tainted. Her value declined in the eyes of society. She might never remarry. She might be cast out by her family. Meanwhile, a man who divorced could remarry without question. He could start over. He could even reclaim property and children, leaving his former wife with nothing. This inequality was baked into the system. In aristocratic families, the stakes were even. Higher marriages weren't just contracts, they were treaties. Entire kingdoms could hinge on a wedding. A princess might be married off at 12 or 13, shipped to a foreign court, and expected to represent her homeland. She didn't know the language, she didn't know the customs, but she was told to adapt. Her role was clear: bear sons, and strengthen alliances. Even queens had little control over their personal lives. Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of King Henry VIII, was married at 16 and spent decades trying to secure her position. When she failed to produce a male heir, her marriage was annulled. Her reputation was shattered, and she was lucky compared to others. Many women throughout history were accused of witchcraft, adultery, or treason simply because their husbands no longer wanted them. The accusation itself was enough. Trials were a formality. The verdict was often predetermined. All of this kept women in line. Fear was a tool. So was shame. A woman who defied her husband could be labeled a disgrace. Her family might disown her. Her children could be taken away. Her name could be erased from records, as if she had never existed. And yet, despite this immense pressure, women endured. Some found ways to resist. Some used wit, charm, or quiet diplomacy to influence their husbands. Others confided in servants, sisters, or nuns, anyone who would listen. But the structure remained the same. Marriage was a cage built to look like a crown. In some cultures, dowries added another layer of control. The bride's family had to pay the groom's family, often in gold, land, or livestock. If the woman misbehaved, the husband could keep the dowry and send her back. That financial penalty alone kept many women trapped in loveless or abusive marriages. Honor played a role too. A woman's purity was tied to her family's reputation. If she was seen alone with a man, even without physical contact, rumors could destroy her. If she tried to escape a violent marriage, it was considered dishonorable. Her own parents might refuse to shelter her. She was expected to endure silently. This expectation spanned continents. In feudal Japan, samurai wives were expected to be loyal to death. In the Ottoman Empire, concubines and wives lived under strict surveillance in the harem. In medieval Europe, noble women were traded like chess pieces, while peasant women were married off to secure extra hands in the field. Everywhere, the pattern was the same. The man chose, the woman followed. Education was denied or limited. A girl trained not in philosophy or politics, but in obedience and household duties, needlework, cooking, child-rearing. She was told her husband would guide her, that he knew better, that he was the head and she the heart. But what if the head was cruel? What if the heart broke? There were stories, quiet ones, of women who resisted. Some escaped. Some poisoned their husbands. Some found refuge in convents, where at least they could avoid forced marriage and find peace in prayer. But these were rare exceptions. Most simply endured. Some cried quietly at night. Others accepted their fate and tried to find meaning in motherhood, faith, or routine. They sang lullabies. They lit candles. They stitched their pain into the hems of clothing and carried on. And time passed. The marriage trap was not just a social practice. It was a psychological prison. Girls were raised to believe they were born for this role. That submission was virtue, that sacrifice was holy, and by the time they questioned it, it was too late. The home became a theater of silence. Secrets lived in its walls. And through all the centuries, one thing remained constant. The woman in the marriage almost always had the least power, the least freedom, and the most to lose. For most of history, childbirth was the most dangerous moment in a woman's life. It was not a joyful, glowing event filled with doctors and safety nets. It was a quiet walk along the edge of death, a test of endurance, pain, and hope. Every pregnancy was a gamble. Every labor could end in tragedy. There were no trained doctors for most women, no sterile equipment, no anesthesia, no understanding of germs or infection. The entire process took place in dark rooms, with minimal light, and often incomplete. Silence. The only support came from midwives, some experienced, others barely trained. Their tools were basic. Their knowledge was passed down through stories, not science. Pain relief didn't exist. Screaming was often discouraged. Women were expected to suffer quietly, as generations before them had. Crying out too much was seen as weak or shameful. Some were even told that the more pain they endured, the more noble they were. And so they suffered in silence. The risk of death during childbirth was staggering. In some places, 1 in 10 mothers died in labor. In others, the odds were worse. Bleeding, infection, obstructed labor, any of these could kill a woman within hours. Once the labor began, there was no way to predict the outcome. Were common, so were miscarriages. Many women buried multiple children before their own deaths. Graves of small infants filled churchyards, backyards, and open fields. But it wasn't just the children who were at risk. The mother could slip away just as easily. Some died before they ever held their child. Others lingered in fever and agony. For days, succumbing to infections like childbed fever, caused simply by unwashed hands. Yet, the expectation remained. Women were told to produce heirs. Not just one child, but many. The more sons, the better. A woman's value was often measured by how many children she could provide. If a baby died, she was expected to conceive again. If she miscarried, she was told to try harder. Rest was rarely an option. Grief wasn't always permitted. The emotional toll was heavy, but it was hidden. There were no therapists, no support groups. A woman who lost a child was expected to carry on. She might weep in secret, perhaps in the dead of night. But during the day she resumed her duties, cooking, cleaning, smiling when necessary. Her heart could be breaking, but no one asked. Grief was a luxury, and silence became her companion. Society did not see her trauma. It only saw her function in elite families. Childbirth was a public matter. Royal women were expected to give birth in front of witnesses to prove the child was legitimate. Dozens of people might fill the room as a queen cried out in pain. Her body became part of the state. Her child was a political tool. If she failed to deliver a healthy son, she was often blamed. Even if the cause was beyond her control, stillbirths were not understood. Genetic issues, infections, poor nutritional of these played a role, but no one knew. A woman might be accused of witchcraft, sin, or carelessness. She might be shamed for what her body simply couldn't prevent. Even the survivors didn't escape harm. Many women were left with long-term injuries, torn muscles, internal bleeding, incontinence, prolapsed organs. Conditions like fistulas, caused by prolonged labor, left some women permanently damaged, leaking urine or feces, isolated due to the smell and shame, and still, they were expected to try again. Nutrition played a major role. Pregnant women needed strength, but food was often scarce. Poor women worked long hours in the fields, bent over crops, even during the final weeks of pregnancy. Rich women might have had more food, but less exercise, leading to complications from inactivity. Hygiene was poor across the board. Dirty linens, contaminated water, no sanitation. Afterbirth was wiped away with unwashed cloth. Midwives reused tools without cleaning them. No one understood infection. No one understood bacteria. If the placenta didn't come out completely, it could kill the mother within days. In many cultures, religious customs surrounded birth. Some believed evil spirits targeted women in labor. Amulets were hung above the bed. Prayers were whispered. Sacred objects were tied to the mother's wrist or neck. These rituals provided comfort, but not safety. Often, a priest stood outside the room, ready to deliver last rites. For the child, life was just as fragile. Neonatal care didn't exist. Premature babies rarely survived. Infants who didn't cry were often declared stillborn, even if they were simply slow to breathe. Babies with deformities might be hidden, abandoned, or quietly buried. Women had to detach. They had to be strong. Some refused to name their children until weeks after birth, fearing they wouldn't survive. Emotional walls were built out of necessity. Maternal bonds formed quickly, but heartbreak came just as fast. And yet, despite all this, childbirth continued. Over and over, women gave birth in castles, huts, wagons, tents, during war, during famine, during plague. Some labored alone in fields. Some delivered babies while fleeing danger. It was not rare, it was constant. The average woman might have 6, 7, or more pregnancies in her lifetime. Some had 15. Others had even more. The body wore down, bones weakened, blood thinned, and when the body finally gave out, it was often in childbirth. Women died young, many in their 20s or 30s, not from violence, but from bearing life. The cycle was brutal. Conceive, carry, deliver, recover, conceive again. No breaks, no choices. Contraception was rare, dangerous, or forbidden. Abstinence was not often respected. Marital duties were enforced. There was no escape. Still, stories of strength emerged. Midwives who became legends in their villages. Mothers who saved their babies at the cost of their own lives. Women who endured a dozen pregnancies and lived to tell their stories. But these tales were whispered, not celebrated. No monuments were built for them. No songs were sung. Their stories were passed down through scars and lullabies, through heirloom blankets and worn-out cradles, through a tired smile or a hollow stare. Pain became heritage. Grief became tradition. And all the while, society kept its expectations unchanged. A woman's body was a vessel, a duty, a hope. If she succeeded, she was praised. If she failed, she was blamed. If she died, she was mourned quietly, then replaced. Another bride would be found. Another womb would be filled. This was the fate of millions across centuries. And though the world changed slowly over time, for much of history, childbirth remained a silent battlefield, one where the victories were small, the losses immense, and the warriors were women, unknown and unseen. In ancient Rome, a woman's world was the home, not just a place to live, but a cage with painted walls. The Roman word domos meant household, but for many women, it also meant isolation. The ideal Roman woman was silent. She didn't speak out. She didn't argue. She existed in the background, modest and unseen. Her value was measured not by her thoughts, but by her behavior. The more invisible she was in public, the more praise she received in private from childhood. Roman girls were prepared for this life. While boys learned rhetoric, politics, and warfare, girls learned discipline and quiet labor. Mothers taught them to spin thread, weave cloth, and serve without complaint. Dolls were traded for spindles. Games ended early. Marriage followed soon after. Girls could be married off by age 12. The groom was chosen by her father, often older, wealthier, and in control. Once married, she left her family home and entered the household of her husband. From that point forward, her life was no longer her own. Movement outside the home was restricted. A Roman matron did not wander the streets. That was for slaves, messengers, or market women. Noble wives were expected to stay inside, away from the chaos of public life. If she left the house, she was usually accompanied by slaves, by guards, or by family. Eyes were always watching. In the home, she was never alone. Even in the wealthiest villas, privacy was rare. Servants moved freely. In-laws often lived under the same roof. Elderly parents, brothers-in-law, even distant cousins might share the same household. In this crowded space, a woman's life was observed at every moment. She was watched when she cooked, watched when she breastfed, watched when she managed the household budget. Her mistakes were noted. Her obedience was tested, and expectations were high. A Roman wife was responsible for the domestic order. She oversaw food storage. She kept account of textiles, oil, wine, and grain. She managed the slaves, disciplining them if needed, assigning chores, and keeping them efficient. If the home ran smoothly, her husband was praised. If it failed, she was blamed. Her hands were never idle. Spinning wool was seen as the virtue of Roman womanhood. Even in elite households, noble women were expected to spin and weave. Statues and tombstones often portrayed women with distaff and spindle in hand. This wasn't just craftwork, it was ideology. A silent woman working with wool was the image of the perfect wife. Weaving was more than a chore, it was a symbol. The threads of cloth reflected the threads of loyalty, patience, and order. A well-spun garment showed discipline. A poorly woven one hinted at laziness or rebellion. Don't and so, they spun, thread by thread, day after day. Child-rearing was her second duty. She was expected to produce children, preferably sons, and raise them according to Roman virtues, courage, loyalty, duty. Even though tutors were sometimes hired for boys, the mother oversaw their early education. She taught them manners, she corrected their posture, she told them stories of Roman heroes. If the child failed in society, the mother was blamed. Stillbirths, miscarriages, or infant deaths were common. But grief had no place in the Roman home. The woman was expected to move forward, to try again. A fertile woman brought honor to her husband. A barren one brought shame. If she complained, she was weak. If she cried too long, she was indulgent. Her pain belonged to the shadows of the home. Religion was another duty. Roman women played roles in household rituals. They offered prayers to the household gods, the Lares and Penates. Each morning she lit lamps and sprinkled wine on small altars. These rituals were believed to keep the family safe, the harvest full, and the gods satisfied. It was yet another layer of responsibility, another silent task that kept her in place. Even in legal matters, women had little power. A woman needed a guardian, a tutor, to represent her in contracts or lawsuits. In early Rome, she could not own property freely. Over time, some legal rights expanded, but in practice, most decisions were still made by men. Even her voice was controlled. Women could not vote. They could not serve in political office. They could not plead cases in court. Their opinions were heard only within the walls of their home. Public speech by a woman was reran, often criticized. Even laughter could be judged. A loud woman was dangerous. A silent one was praised. And still, not all homes were the same. In poorer families, women sometimes worked outside. They sold vegetables, made textiles, or ran taverns. Their freedom was greater, but their lives were harder. They carried water from wells, fetched firewood, and cooked over open flames. They had more movement, but less safety. In both rich and poor homes, the pattern remained. The woman served, the man ruled. For elite women, occasional exceptions existed. Some influenced politics from behind the scenes. Others gained fame through scandal or beauty. But these women were the exception, not the norm. Most women lived in the shadow of the domos, following rules that had no end. Slaves added another layer of complexity. In large households, dozens of slaves worked daily. Some cooked, others cleaned, others watched the children. Some female slaves were closer to the mistress. They dressed her, brushed her hair, listened to her secrets. But they also reported back to the husband if ordered. There was no trust, only layers of surveillance. Even in her own room, a woman could not speak freely. The home itself was designed to keep women hidden. The atrium open and airy was for guests. Men met clients and hosted dinners. The women stayed deeper inside the house, in rooms with narrow windows, in spaces meant for sewing, praying, or nursing. She lived in the inner world, not the outer one. And yet, Roman writers praised this life. They praised the woman who remained indoors, who never spoke back, who kept her eyes lowered, who stayed loyal. Even when neglected, the silent wife was a Roman virtue. The obedient wife was an ideal. Even tombstones repeated this image. One might read, "She stayed in the house. She spun wool. She kept faith." No mention of dreams, no mention of fear, just obedience. Even the language reflected it. The Latin word for husband, dominus, also meant master. The home, the domos, belonged to him. She was a part of it. Like the walls, like the furniture, respected, perhaps, but never free. This was the domestic prison, not built with iron bars, but with expectations, not enforced by soldiers, but by fathers, husbands, and customs. No escape, only routine, only duty, and day after day, women endured it, with quiet hands and quiet hearts. Throughout much of history, a woman's worth was measured not by her thoughts, her skills, or her kindness, but by her virtue. And virtue meant one thing above all else: chastity. From girlhood, the rules were clear. A woman was to remain pure, modest, and silent. Her body did not belong to her, belonged to her family's honor. One wrong step, one rumor, one accusation could destroy her future. She was expected to walk carefully, to speak softly, to lower her eyes. Modesty was not just encouraged, it was enforced. Girls were taught to cover their bodies, avoid laughter in public, and never spend time alone with men. Even an innocent conversation could lead to scandal. If people talked, the damage was done whether it was true or not. Silence became a defense. Many women learned early that saying less meant staying safe. To be quiet was to be good. A talkative girl was seen as wild. A curious woman, dangerous. Virginity was prized above all else. In many societies, a bride's virginity was proof of her family's honor. If she was not a virgin, it brought shame not just to her, but to her parents, her siblings, even her distant cousins. The weight of this expectation was crushing. Some cultures required proof on the wedding night. Blood-stained sheets were displayed, celebrated. If there was no blood, questions were asked. Accusations followed. Sometimes, punishment. A woman's private life became public property. Even myths reinforced these values. In ancient Rome, the story of Lucretia was told again and again. She was a noble woman, beautiful, loyal, and virtuous. When she was raped by a prince, she took her own life, not out of shame for what was done to her, but because her honor had been stained. Her death was seen as noble, an act of devotion to virtue, but the message was cruel. The story taught women that death was preferable to dishonor, that silence, suffering, and even suicide were signs of purity, that even victims had something to prove. Rape was not seen as a crime against the woman. It was seen as a crime against her family or her husband. The woman's pain was secondary. Her voice was ignored. Her truth doubted. Victims were often silenced. Some were forced into marriage with their rapist. Others were blamed for what happened, accused of dressing wrong, speaking too freely, or simply being in the wrong place. Their trauma was dismissed, their names forgotten. In many places, a woman who was assaulted lost her value. Not just socially, but legally. She might be disowned, cast out, labeled as impure, even when she had done nothing wrong. Some were punished more than the men who hurt them. Honor was not about justice. It was about appearance, to protect family honor. Some fathers or brothers took extreme measures. If a daughter was suspected of impropriety, whether true or imagined, she could be beaten, imprisoned, or killed. Her death would restore the family's reputation. These were called honor killings. They were not limited to one time or culture. From ancient Rome to medieval Europe to parts of the modern world, they occurred under many names. The law sometimes looked away. Judges showed leniency. Communities remained silent. The woman's life was seen as expendable if her virtue was questioned. Even the suspicion of a relationship outside marriage could lead to violence. If a girl smiled at the wrong man, if she walked home alone, if someone whispered her name too loudly, her life could change in an instant. This obsession with virtue extended to marriage. Wives were expected to remain completely faithful. Husbands, however, were often forgiven for straying. Their infidelity was ignored or excused. A man's desires were natural. A woman's were dangerous. A wife who cheated could be divorced, imprisoned, publicly humiliated, in some cases executed. Yet a husband could take mistresses, visit brothels, and father children outside marriage with little consequence. The double standard was clear. Even widows were judged. A woman who remarried too soon after her husband's death was seen as greedy or unfaithful. Some were expected to remain in mourning for years, dressed in black, alone, forgotten. Their virtue had an expiration date. Widowed young, stay quiet. Married off too early, stay loyal. Abused in silence. Endure it at every stage. A woman's moral value was monitored. Social norms, religious teachings, and family expectations all reinforced the same idea that a woman's honor was fragile, like glass. One crack, and it was ruined forever. And it wasn't only men who enforced these rules. Other women did too. Mothers, grandmothers, aunts, they passed down the same warnings. They guarded their daughters closely, taught them to fear their own bodies, to distrust others, to avoid shame at all costs. In some cases, women policed each other more harshly than men did. Gossip was a powerful weapon. A rumor could travel fast. A glance could be misread. A moment alone with a man could become a lifetime of punishment. The pressure to appear perfect led many women to live double lives. Outwardly obedient, inwardly terrified. They wore modest clothing, but feared unwanted attention. They smiled politely, but feared being misunderstood. They followed the rules, but never felt safe. Stories of fallen women were used as cautionary tales. These women were not evil. Many were victims of misfortune, or simply too trusting, but their names were remembered with scorn, their choices picked apart, their pain turned into a warning, and the message was always the same: be good or be ruined, stay silent or be shamed, follow the rules or be erased. Some women tried to resist. A few managed to escape the system. They fled their families, changed their names, hid their pasts. But most couldn't. They were trapped by walls that were invisible but unbreakable. And yet, despite the cruelty, many endured. They played the part. They guarded their reputations. They prayed no one would accuse them. They hoped their silence would protect them. But silence is a heavy thing. It weighs on the heart. It changes how a person sees themselves. For many women, the fear of shame became part of their identity. It shaped every choice, every word, every step. Generations passed. the rules stayed. From the mythical Lucretia to nameless women in stone villages and crowded cities, the obsession with female virtue continued. It dictated lives, controlled futures, and justified pain, and all in the name of honor. In the ancient world, religion shaped every part of life, from politics to farming, from war to birth. Every action had a divine explanation. The gods watched from above, the people obeyed below, but within this system of worship, not everyone stood equal. Women were both sacred and restricted. They were praised for their role in religion, but barred from its power, revered for their purity, but distrusted for their bodies. Spirituality gave women purpose, but it also kept them in chains. In most cultures, women were excluded from formal priesthoods. Sacred rituals were often reserved for men. Public ceremonies, sacrifices, and festivals were led by male priests, magistrates, and rulers. The altar was a place of power, and women stood behind it, not beside it. Even when women were allowed to participate, their roles were limited. They carried baskets, they sang hymns, they cleaned sacred spaces. But the decisions, the theology, the voice of the gods, those belonged to men. The male body was seen as stable, pure, rational. The female body was something else entirely. Superstition surrounded every part of it. Menstruation was feared. Some believed it could sour wine, kill crops, or rust metal. Others thought it weakened the sacred flame or offended the gods. A menstruating woman was often barred from temples. She was told to stay home, to stay silent. This fear wasn't based on science. It was rooted in control. Childbirth was no different. It was seen as both a miracle and a danger. Sacred, but messy. Holy, but polluting. Many believed childbirth made a woman impure. She had to undergo cleansing rituals before rejoining society. A new mother might be banned from touching food or entering holy places. Some weren't allowed to sleep in the same bed as their husbands. The pain of birth was seen as punishment, the blood a sign of sin. Religion explained this with myths. In many traditions, women were blamed for humanity's downfall. In Greek myth, Pandora opened the box that unleashed suffering. In Abrahamic texts, Eve took the forbidden fruit. In both, women were the cause of the curse. And religion reminded them of it again and again. Still, not all women were excluded from sacred roles in ancient Rome. One rare path existed, the Vestal Virgins. They were priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Chosen as young girls, usually between 6 and 10, they left their families and entered a world of ritual and discipline. For 30 years, they served in silence. Their job was to keep the sacred fire of Rome burning. It could never go out. If it did, it meant disaster. They performed daily sacrifices, kept secret rituals, and maintained the city's spiritual purity. In many ways, they were honored. They could own property. They had legal independence. They could pardon prisoners. Their word held weight in court. Unlike most women, they didn't need male guardians. People stepped aside when they passed in public. Even the emperor showed them respect. But this power came at a cost. They had to remain virgins absolutely, without exception. If a Vestal was found to have broken her vow, she was buried alive. Not executed, not imprisoned, buried. A hole dug in the earth, her body placed inside, and the dirt poured back over her. No appeal, no defense, just silence. The Romans believed spilling a Vestal's blood would anger the gods, so they killed her without shedding it. A cruel twist of logic. one rooted in superstition and fear. Even as they walked freely, the Vestals lived in confinement. Their bodies were watched, their movements tracked, their thoughts restricted. Power, yes, but never full freedom. Other women served as oracles or seers. At Delphi, the Pythia spoke in riddles, breathing sacred fumes and channeling Apollo. Her words shaped decisions across the Greek world. Yet even she was controlled, managed by male priests, protected by guards, and limited in what she could say. Her voice was divine, but still directed by men in Egypt. Some priestesses held important roles. They sang, danced, and even oversaw temple finances. But as time passed, these positions faded. Eventually, women were pushed further out of sacred life. Ritual became male territory once again. Religious purity codes reinforced this divide. Women were constantly monitored for signs of uncleanliness. Blood, birth, even touch could make them impure. They were kept separate, seen as unstable, dangerous. Their faith was often measured not by belief, but by obedience. If they followed the rules, they were holy. If they questioned them, they were heretics. In many places, women were forbidden from reading sacred texts, or interpreting them, or teaching them. Scripture was written by men, taught by men, enforced by men. When women spoke up, they were punished. Some were accused of witchcraft, others of heresy, others simply labeled as immoral. Their spirituality was feared, especially if it didn't follow the script. A woman who prayed too loudly, fasted too long, or wept too much could be seen as possessed. Religion became a tool not only of worship, but of control. Moral behavior was linked to piety, and piety was linked to silence, submission, and chastity. A good woman prayed quietly, covered her body, obeyed her father, her husband, and her God. A bad woman asked questions. Religious leaders used this to justify social rules. If a woman disobeyed her husband, she was disobeying divine order. If she wanted to remain single, she was rejecting her role. If she spoke in public, she was stepping out of line. Every decision was framed as spiritual failure. The burden of virtue rested on the woman's shoulders. Her clothing, her speech, her body, everything was a reflection of her faith. If something went wrong in society, she was an easy target. Plagues, famines, misfortune, these were blamed on disobedient women, on impure women, on women who danced, or laughed, or stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. Superstition filled the gaps where understanding was missing. Eclipses were blamed on women's sins. Stillbirths on their hidden thoughts. Droughts on their dishonor. And religion gave these fears structure, gave them legitimacy, wrapped them in ritual and sacred language. And so, women followed the rules. They whispered prayers. They avoided temples during their cycles. They hid their pain after childbirth. They lived with fear in one hand and faith in the other. And yet, faith also gave comfort. In the quiet of the home, some women built their own altars, lit candles, offered herbs, sang softly to the gods. In their isolation, they found meaning. In their silence, they found strength. Their rituals, though small, gave them peace. But even in faith, they were watched. Even in worship, they were managed. Religion offered salvation, but only through obedience. It told women they were sacred, but only if they submitted. And for centuries, this balance held sacred, but submissive, holy, but controlled. For most of history, the law did not protect women. It controlled them, judged them, punished them, but it rarely defended them. In the home, on the streets, and in court, women were vulnerable to violence with little hope of justice. Society accepted this as normal. The law often supported it. Domestic violence was common. A man could strike his wife without fear. In many places, it was his legal right. The home was his domain. The wife, his responsibility. If she disobeyed, embarrassed him, or failed in her duties, he was permitted, sometimes even encouraged, to discipline her. This discipline could be verbal, it could be physical, it could leave bruises, scars, or broken bones. But as long as she lived, it was not considered abuse. It was considered order. Some legal codes even set rules for how a man could beat his wife. With what size stick, how often, what parts of the body. These details were not created to protect women, but to preserve the husband's authority. Neighbors might hear cries from the home, but few would intervene. It was seen as a private matter, a family issue, something not to be questioned. The woman had nowhere to go. There were no shelters, no police support, no system of reporting. If she ran away, she could be dragged back. If she fought back, she risked harsher punishment. The law saw her as property, and property does not argue. Adultery was another area where the law treated women harshly. In many cultures, a man who committed adultery faced no punishment or a small one. But a woman caught in the same act could lose everything: her reputation, her marriage, her freedom, even her life. In ancient Rome, the Lex Julia punished women for adultery by exile. A husband could send his wife away, strip her of her dowry, and force her into isolation. Meanwhile, he could keep a mistress, visit brothels, or sleep with slaves without consequence. His honor remained untouched. Hers did not. Even if the woman had been coerced, blackmailed, or forced, the law rarely cared. Consent was difficult to prove. A woman who accused a powerful man was rarely believed, and if she stayed silent, she was still punished. Execution was legal in some cases. If a father caught his unmarried daughter in the act of adultery, he could kill both her and the man. A husband could kill his wife if she was caught in his home with another man, especially if the man was of lower status. These were called honor killings. Not only permitted, sometimes expected, the law made examples of women. If one stepped out of line, she was punished so others would not follow. Fear kept the rest obedient, and punishment came in many forms. Some women were stripped and paraded through the streets, their hair cut, their clothes torn, insults hurled by crowds. Public shaming was a spectacular warning to all women about the cost of dishonor. It wasn't about justice. It was about humiliation. In other cases, women were exiled, sent far from their families, forced to live in remote places, alone, cut off from their children, their relatives, their community. Their names became whispers, their presence erased. Some were imprisoned in their homes, locked away by husbands or fathers, fed sparingly, forbidden from speaking to others, watched by servants or guards. All of this was legal. Even crimes committed against women were often blamed on them. If a woman was assaulted, the question was not what the man did, but what she did to provoke it. Where was she walking? What was she wearing? Why was she alone? Victim blaming was routine, justice rare. Some women were punished for the crimes of others. If a man committed treason, his wife could be exiled too. If a son rebelled, his mother might be accused of raising him poorly. Guilt traveled through bloodlines. For enslaved women, There was no law at all. They could be beaten, raped, or killed by their masters with no consequence. If they resisted, they were tortured. If they spoke up, they were silenced. No court would hear their case. Even noblewomen were not safe. Their wealth might delay punishment, but not prevent it. If they embarrassed their family or crossed political lines, they too could be publicly disgraced. Some were poisoned, others forced to take their own lives. A few were dragged into court, accused of crimes, and used as tools in political rivalries. Their downfall was entertainment. The laws were written by men, interpreted by men, enforced by men, and always in favor of male control. A woman's loyalty was never assumed, her virtue never protected, her pain never prioritized, and yet she was always watched. Any sign of rebellion, any rumor of misconduct, any slip of the tongues, these could become evidence. Her letters, her clothes, her friends, all could be used against her. Even silence could be suspicious. Widows were also vulnerable. Without a husband's protection, they could be taken advantage of, their property seized, their rights challenged, their behavior judged more harshly than before. If she remained single, she was seen as strange. If she remarried quickly, she was accused of greed. The law provided no clear, pathally shifting dangers. Religious laws added another layer. In many traditions, religious codes dictated punishment. A woman who disobeyed was not just breaking social rules, she was sinning. This gave punishment moral weight, divine justification. Religious courts sometimes flogged women in public, or branded them, or forced them to wear special clothing to mark their shame. Some were accused of witchcraft or impurity. Others were blamed for failing to follow sacred customs. These accusations were difficult to disprove and often fatal. Confessions were extracted under torture. Trials were quick. Mercy rare, and yet many women still found ways to survive. They learned to stay quiet, to act carefully, to protect their children, to hide their fears. They formed networks with other women, passing on warnings, sharing advice, offering comfort. Sometimes they resisted quietly, sabotaging rules from within the home, using religion, stories, or small acts of defiance to hold on to dignity. But the threat of violence always loomed, and the law was never on their side. In ancient Rome, beauty was not just about appearance. It was a measure of worth, a sign of virtue, and a source of endless pressure. For women, looking beautiful was never just a choice. It was a duty. The Roman ideal of female beauty was rigid and demanding. Women were expected to maintain a specific look, one that was both impossible and painful to achieve. At the center of this ideal stood pale skin, plucked brows, smooth limbs, and a youthful face untouched by age or experience. Light skin was prized above all else. A fair complexion suggested wealth, refinement, and a life spent indoors far from the sun and the labor of the poor. Women went to great lengths to lighten their skin. Some used chalk, white lead, or ground oyster shells. These substances, applied as powders or creams, often damaged the skin. Some caused rashes, others contained toxins. But the goal was clear: to appear delicate, untouched by the harsh world outside. Smooth skin was another requirement. Hair on the body was seen as ugly, unfeminine, even dirty. Women removed it, constantly, often with tools that inflicted pain. Resin wax was smeared across the skin, left to harden, then ripped away. Pumice stones were used to grind down hair on arms and legs. Sometimes sharp seashells or bronze razors were used. These methods left cuts, burns, and irritation, but was non-negotiable. Eyebrows were shaped thin and arched. Unibrows were unfashionable. Women plucked hair strand by strand with tweezers. Painful, slow, and done often. Some dyed their brows or painted them back on with soot or charcoal for definition. Heavy makeup followed. The ideal Roman woman painted her face with thick, white foundation, layered on rouge for color, and added dark eyeliner for dramatic effect. This look was not subtle, it was deliberate. Faces were crafted like sculptures, but the ingredients used were often dangerous. White lead was common in skin creams. Red pigments came from crushed insects or toxic minerals like cinnabar. Cosmetics were made with soot, antimony, or ashes. Over time, these damaged the skin and poisoned the body. Still, beauty was worth the risk, because in Rome, looking good was tied directly to morality. A well-groomed woman was seen as disciplined. A careless one was judged as lazy, promiscuous, or unfit for marriage. Beauty wasn't just decoration, it was character. It was honor, and youthfulness mattered most of all. Women were expected to look young for as long as possible. Wrinkles were feared, gray hair hidden. Aging was not seen as natural, it was seen as failure. Some used animal fat mixed with herbs to smooth the skin. Others applied crushed pearls or honey to soften the face. Hair was dyed with strange potions, sometimes made from leek's ash, or even rotting leeches soaked in wine. The message was clear: grow old, but never show it. Even teenagers were pressured. Brides as young as 12 were expected to adopt adult beauty standards. They wore makeup, styled their hair in elaborate ways, and learned to conceal any sign of childhood. The hairstyles themselves were statements. Roman women curled, braided, and pinned their hair into complex forms. Some wore wigs made of hair imported from Germany or India. Others bleached their hair with lime or dyed it red with henna. These styles took hours to create and even longer to maintain. Servants or slaves often did the work, brushing, braiding, applying pastes and powders. But mistakes were not tolerated. Roman poets mock women with poorly done hair or uneven makeup. A smudge of kohl, a streak of rouge, a drooping curl, these were social disasters. Beauty was a public performance. Even at home, a woman was judged. Husbands expected their wives to remain attractive. Families expected daughters to draw good. Marriage offers. Mothers taught their girls how to beautify early. Girls grew up watching their mothers at the mirror, learning which creams to apply and which hairs to pluck. The mirror itself became a symbol of control. Roman literature often portrayed women as obsessed with appearance. Satirical writers mocked them for spending too much time grooming. But this ridicule ignored the truth. Women were required to look a certain way. They were shamed for trying and shamed for failing. It was a trap. Poor women faced even more challenges. They couldn't afford expensive cosmetics or imported perfumes. They used ash instead of powder, animal fat instead of cream, rough razors instead of bronze ones. Still, they were judged by the same standards. If a poor woman looked unkempt, it was seen as proof of her lower character. If a wealthy woman looked plain, it was interpreted as rebellion or defiance, and rebellion was dangerous. Some women tried to push back. A few philosophers' wives avoided makeup and fancy hairstyles as statements of modesty. Some poets praised natural beauty, but these voices were rare, and society pushed back harder. A beautiful woman was praised, but only if she remained modest. If she took too much pride in her looks, she was called vain. If she drew attention, she was called a temptress. If men looked at her, it was her fault. Her beauty had to be flawless, but also invisible. She had to attract, but not tempt. She had to impress, but not provoke. The rules were endless and always changing. Even death did not end the pressure on Roman tombs. Women were praised for their beauty more often than for intelligence or kindness. Epitaphs described soft skin, fair color, gentle features. The perfect woman, even in stone, had to be beautiful. And so, women lived with the mirror as their judge. Day after day, they lived with burnt skin, plucked hair, aching arms from curling, red eyes from smoky pigments. They smiled with painted lips, even as the lead slowly poisoned them. Their pain was hidden behind powder, their labor dismissed as vanity, their bodies shaped by expectation. Roman beauty was not freedom. It was a performance, a duty, a mask, one that every woman was expected to wear and never take off. In the roaring arenas of ancient Rome, blood was entertainment. Crowds gathered to see death. Steel met flesh, and the sand turned red. The gladiator was a symbol of power, brutal, admired, and feared. But not all fighters were men. A few were women. They were called gladiatresses, female gladiators. Rare, unusual, and controversial, they did not fight for honor. They were not seen as warriors. They were treated as spectacle. Men fought for fame, for freedom, for legacy. Women fought for amusement. Their presence in the arena was not about skill. It was about curiosity, about shock, about humiliation to the Roman audience. A woman holding a sword was unnatural, strange, entertaining, and that was exactly the point. They were not heroes. They were novelties. The earliest mentions of female gladiators appear during the height of the empire. By the 1st century CE, they were appearing in some games, not often, not in great numbers, but enough to stir interest and outrage. Roman writers didn't know what to make of them. Some mocked them, others were disgusted. A few were fascinated. To the elite, a woman in armor was a joke. To the poor, she was a thrill. To everyone, she was an object. Most female gladiators were slaves. Others were criminals. Some were even free-born women who volunteered, seeking fame or escape. But once they entered the arena, all were seen the same dot as tools for entertainment. They trained like male gladiators. They lived in gladiator schools, ate strict diets, practiced daily, learned to wield swords, tridents, or nets. But they were rarely given the same respect. The fights were choreographed for drama, weapons sometimes dulled, outcomes often rigged, but the blood was still real, the injuries permanent, the risk of death constant. The crowd cheered not for bravery but for the absurdity of it. A woman swinging a sword, a woman chasing an opponent, a woman bleeding in the sand. It was thrilling and degrading. Their bodies were exposed, their clothing minimal, tunics were short, armor was light. This wasn't about protection, it was about display. Spectators jeered, commentators gossiped, officials laughed. Sometimes the matches were staged between women. Other times, a woman fought a dwarf, or an animal, or a child. The goal was not fairness. It was shock. These were not contests. They were performances. The Romans loved irony, and for them, nothing was more ironic than a woman trained to kill. A creature meant to nurture, now covered in sweat and blood. She became a walking contradiction, and the crowd loved it. But not everyone approved. As female gladiators became more visible, some senators pushed back. They argued it was shameful, that women had a role to serve, to raise children, to remain modest, not to fight. Even emperors began to limit their presence. Under Emperor Septimius Severus, female gladiators were officially banned in 200 CE. The law stated that women should not disgrace themselves in the arena. It was not about safety, it was about image. Roman morality was tied to appearances, and the sight of a bloodied woman wielding a sword was too much. The ban was both a punishment and a warning, a return to traditional roles. But the damage was done. The image of the gladiatrix remained burned into the Roman imagination. Even banned, she lived on in art and gossip, in graffiti on city walls, in poems whispered at banquets, in satire written to provoke. Some depictions showed women with shields and helmets, others with breasts exposed, taunting the crowd. These were not historical records. They were fantasies, caricatures. The female gladiator became a symbol not of power, but of rebellion, and rebellion had to be crushed. In Roman society, a woman's place was clear. She belonged in the home, not the arena. Her weapons were weaving, childbirth, and silence. Anything else was scandal. By stepping into the ring, she stepped out of line, and Rome did not forgive that easily. Female fighters were remembered not for their courage, but for their disruption. They were reduced to curiosities, their names lost, their stories erased. Only a few traces remain. A tombstone found in Turkey shows two women named Amazon and Achillea. They fought bravely, it says. It doesn't say who won. It doesn't say what happened after. Just that the crowd was impressed. Another statue shows a female figure with a sword and shield. Scholars argue whether she was a real fighter or an artistic fantasy. The line between truth and performance blurs. Even in death, they were spectacles. Some gladiatrices likely fought in private games, held in noble households or country villas. These shows were smaller, less public, but just as brutal. Sometimes, even more so. There, in the garden of a senator, two women might be made to fight for the pleasure of guests. Laughter mingling with blood, wine spilled as easily as sweat. There, lives were a currency, their pain a prize. But why would any woman agree? Some had no choice. Slaves were trained, sold, and sent into the arena without consent. Others may have volunteered, driven by poverty, desperation, or dreams of fame. The arena offered danger, but also freedom. A gladiator, even briefly, controlled her own space. She faced death, yes, but she also earned cheers, recognition, identity. For some, that was better than silence. Even still, it came at a cost. Once labeled a gladiator, a woman was seen as defiled. Her honor was gone. Her family disgraced. She could not marry. She could not return. She became a creature of the games, celebrated in the arena, but condemned outside it. The sword gave her a moment of power, and then took everything else. Her pain was real, her victories fleeting, her legacy forgotten. The arena was not made for women, but a few entered anyway, not to change the world, not to become legends, but simply because they were forced to, or because the world offered them no better choice. And for a brief moment, they stood under the sun, surrounded by noise. Holding weapons once meant only for men. They fought, they bled, and then they vanished. In a world built to control women, survival became an act of quiet defiance. While the laws, customs, and expectations of ancient Rome sought to keep women obedient and invisible, some found subtle ways to resist. They did not rise with swords or lead revolutions. Their power lay in the everyday, in silence, in strategy. In the long game, many women managed entire households. This wasn't just domestic work, it was economic control. They oversaw dozens of slaves, kept records, organized estates, and ensured that wealth flowed properly. These tasks required intelligence, precision, and authority. Though they worked behind the scenes, their role was essential. Without them, noble villas and even urban homes would fall into disarray. Some women became informal financiers, lending money, investing in property, even managing their own assets if widowed or legally independent. They had to hide these efforts beneath layers of obedience. Too much visibility risked gossip. Too much success invited suspicion. But they worked nonetheless. In rare cases, women left behind personal writings. Most have been lost to time. A few survive in fragments and tombstones, wax tablets, or scratched into stone. These brief records hint at the inner worlds of Roman women. One woman writes of the grief of losing a child. Another praises herself for being faithful and hard-working. A third celebrates her own literacy, rare and subtle boast in a time when most women could not write. These inscriptions are not declarations of rebellion, but they are proof of presence. A voice, a name, a life. Some women influenced politics indirectly. Through their sons, Roman boys were trained by their mothers before they were shaped by the state. And mothers made sure their sons carried their values. They coached them, whispered to them, advised them, and sometimes even steered their ambitions. In private rooms, over dinner tables, in hushed morning conversations, women planted ideas. They guided marriages, careers, and alliances, not with formal power, but with subtle influence. And they knew the cost of failure. A mother who misstepped could be blamed for her son's downfall. A mother who pushed too hard could be called dangerous. But those who mastered the balance often left a deeper mark than any senator. Some women took on even more. When their husbands died or went to war, they ran estates alone. They managed farms, negotiated with tenants, and dealt with legal contracts. Roman law allowed some widows to inherit and control wealth. And while society frowned upon female independence, it could not ignore it when the economy depended on it. These women navigated a narrow path, powerful but discreet. Their lives were full of risk. One mistake and everything could be taken, but still they endured. Among the most remarkable were those who broke the mold entirely. Fulvia, wife of Mark Antony, did more than whisper advice. She took command. When Antony fled Rome, Fulvia stayed behind. She raised troops. She minted coins with her image. She waged war on behalf of her husband and for her own position. Roman historians mocked her, called her ruthless, but her actions left a mark. She was not a shadow. She was a presence. Agrippina the Younger was another force, sister of Caligula, wife of Claudius, mother of Nero. She understood the rules and how to bend them. She maneuvered her way into the imperial palace, married her uncle to solidify her position, and placed her son on the throne. She appeared in public ceremonies, sat beside the emperor, issued orders under her own name. Coins were struck with her face. For a moment, she was one of the most powerful women in Rome, but her power made enemies. Nero turned against her. She was accused of plotting, of controlling him, of overstepping. She was murdered in her villa by assassins sent by her own son. Her story is often told as a warning, but it also shows what was possible. These women were the exception, not the rule. But even their rare successes reveal something deeper, that beneath layers of control, some women found ways to act, to choose, to influence, to survive. Others resisted more quietly. They used marriage contracts to secure better terms. They arranged dowries for their daughters. They refused to remarry after widowhood, choosing independence over status. Some retreated into religion, becoming priestesses or participating in local cults that gave them space to lead, to gather, and to exist outside the home. Others resisted in even smaller ways, refusing to gossip, refusing to flatter, refusing to be silent when silence was expected. These were not loud revolts, but they mattered. Resistance wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was surviving in a system that wanted you broken. Sometimes it was choosing not to speak when others demanded your voice. Sometimes it was daring to teach your daughter to read. Even the act of writing a letter, carving a message, or marking a tomb with your own name was a kind of rebellion. To say I was here, I had thoughts, I mattered, and yet survival required more than will. It required caution, patience, endless sacrifice. Every choice a woman made was weighed against her safety. If she spoke too freely, she risked disgrace. If she acted too boldly, she risked exile. If she gained too much influence, she risked death. Even joy had to be measured. A laugh that carried too far, a dress too bright, a walk alone. All of these could trigger judgment. So women learned to calculate, to move carefully, to say just enough, to speak through others, to hide in plain sight, and still some thrived. They left behind strong sons, lasting estates, quiet legacies. Their names might be lost, but their impact lived on in law, in language, in lineage. They shaped their world through the margins, and for every empress who was remembered, there were thousands of ordinary women who resisted in smaller, invisible ways. A widow who refused to marry again, a mother who protected her daughter's dignity, a sister who passed along a piece of wisdom. Resistance wore many faces, and though the stories were seldom written, they happened every day in silence. Not every woman could be Via. Not every woman wanted to be, but many found ways to live with dignity, even when dignity was denied. In the end, their resistance wasn't always about rebellion. It was about endurance, the strength to endure centuries of control, the courage to raise children in a world that did not value them, the clarity to see the system and still find space inside it to live. They were survivors, not saints, strategists, not rebels, women who made their way through history, unseen but never powerless. History often records the victories of emperors, the declarations of generals, and the legacies of men who ruled with noise. But beneath those loud chapters lived quieter lives, women confined, silenced, controlled, and forgotten. Their stories are not always written in stone or preserved in scrolls. Often, they exist only in fragments of broken inscription, a faded letter, a name carved on a tomb. Yet their impact was real. They ran households, raised future rulers, survived political games, and carried the weight of impossible expectations. They endured pain disguised as beauty, silence mistaken for obedience, and loyalty rewarded with exile. They resisted not always with rebellion, but with resilience. Within walls built to confine them, they found ways to live, to influence, to matter. They shaped empires without ever holding a throne, and though history may forget their faces, the world they built still echoes with their presence. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with Restless Historian. If this journey through the lives of ancient women moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. There are many more forgotten voices waiting in the shadows of time, and we'll be here, listening. Until next time, rest well, and remember the silent architects of the past.